Well, a warm welcome to all of you and welcome to this broadcast on the 8 performance myths holding organisations back from optimal performance. We've got a very healthy audience online, people from the public sector, the private sector, not-for-profit sectors, and geographically dispersed all over the world. So welcome whatever time it is there. It's 9:30 here in Brisbane. There's a little bit of background noise, unfortunately, Murphy's Law, and I thought I'd find a nice secure venue, and I thought I had, and then all of a sudden I started hearing a drill above me. So if you hear a drill above me, there's not much I can do about it at this stage, unfortunately, but so far it's been fairly mild. If you've got questions throughout this broadcast, please type them into the question box over on the right-hand side, because what I intend to do is to stop at different times through the presentation and respond to those questions. So type them in whenever you're ready to ask a question, or even to make a statement for that matter, and I'll attempt to read them all out depending on how many there are. And if I don't get to do that, then I'll obviously do that offline. So why 8? Why are there only 8? Well, there are probably not only 8 performance myths, there's probably many more, but I've been able to identify 8, and I want to share them with you today. And my new book coming out in December this year on performance management for agile organisations not only highlights what these 8 myths are, but they also talk about some ways and means of overcoming those myths. But like all myths, there's always a smidgen of or a dose of reality, in the sense that even though when I share these myths with you, you might say, well, you know, some of that's partially true, and I think it probably is. But I think what's happened is that we have adopted these 8 performance myths holistically and not thought about the consequences of them. So hopefully I am hoping that you'll get something thought-provoking out of the presentation this morning. All right, so there's basically 3 things that I'm attempting to do in this short, sharp session with you. I think the first thing is to talk a little bit about how we evaluate organisational performance. And of course, the most fundamental way we evaluate organisational performance, particularly in the private sector, is look at profit margins. And that was the original way we evaluated performance, but there's a lot more, there are a lot of other factors that come into organisational performance, which of course will impact on the bottom line. So we want to have a look at some of those, and I wanted to share with you my organisational agility model, because what I found in the literature is that whilst there's a lot of books out there on the agile organisation and the need to be agile and so forth, and there's even a whole lot of characteristics on what that actually looks like, there is, or I couldn't find at least, any model that allows an organisational leader to measure the extent to which they're organisationally agile. So some sort of a framework to give an organisation some sort of a benchmark to look at themselves and say, well, are we really agile? And then, of course, I want to share with you what these 8 performance myths are all about, and just give you a touch of ways that I would overcome those myths. But obviously, if you want more information about that, the book is the place to go. So let's move on. So there are 3 things that I'm hoping we get out of today. What I'm showing you now is a summary of the evolution of the way organisational performance has been measured. And there are lots of people in each of these categories who have put very good cases forward about why organisations should be measured against these, against this model. And this model is evolving, so that I dare say that, if we were sitting here in 5 or even 10 years' time, we may well have extended this model even further. But as you can see over on the left-hand side, the very first way that people actually measured organisational performance was by a profit margin. And, obviously if you had a healthy profit after expenses and revenues were calculated, then you were a successful business. Of course that's still the case today, I understand that. But if that's the only way we measure it, then we obviously miss out on the opportunities of actually creating a organisational performance that may achieve that objective. So that was the very first way, and prior to 1950, that was the criteria, if you like, as to how we would measure. Then along came a school of thought that says, well, how about we look at the goal that we're trying to achieve? So how about we set a particular goal? And by setting a particular goal, we can measure ourselves against that goal. So a lot of strategic planning came into play at this stage, and people were starting to, plan what we commonly call SMART goals: specific, measurable, action-based, realistic, and time-limited. So it was really about, if an organisation is successful, then it's really actually achieved its outcomes or its goals. So it's a very outcome-focused model, and so was the profit one. So both the first two are very outcome-driven. And then along came a group of scholars who said, well, hang on a minute, organisations can't really operate in a vacuum. They basically operate, with a whole lot of interdependencies. They have suppliers, they have government, they have customers, the customer base is segmented, and so forth. So the systems model came into play, and the systems model is very much around how we manage the interdependencies that are involved in the organisation. So the systems model is not a relatively new phenomenon. It's been around for a few years now. So that was the next sort of cycle, and each of these actually built upon the previous. So the systems model is not saying, well, we shouldn't have goals. It's simply saying it's a lot more than just trying to achieve an end result. There's a lot more. There's a lot more to it than that. Then along came the process model movement, and the process model movement was really the quality assurance movement that we saw in the last century that said, okay, if we can get all our quality assurance right internally, then we should then produce an efficient and effective product or service that the customer can then utilise. So quality assurance was really the underpinning of the process model. Let's get the process right and the end result will be a good result. So that was the next sort of stage. And again, the process model movement didn't say that there weren't systems in place. They weren't replacing. What each of these models was attempting to do is to build upon the previous. Then we had the stakeholder model, and this is, you could call it the political model, another way of putting it. This is where managing stakeholder expectations becomes critically important to organisational performance. So I'm thinking particularly here of government organisations and agencies that have got a number of different stakeholders, complex stakeholders, and the organisation really has to attempt to reconcile the differences, if there are differences, between the stakeholders. So the stakeholder model became a measurement of evaluating organisational performance. And probably the latest one is the competing values model. Now the competing values model is really saying, I understand that we've got to have some degree of compliance, we've got to have some systems and ways of doing things and some methodologies, but we also need to be flexible and manoeuvrable and agile. Is it possible that we can actually have those competing values under the same roof? So the competing values model was very much around what they call the ambidextrous organisation. That is, an organisation that can be both flexible and compliant. And that has been a response, of course, to the environment that we're in at the moment. So I just want to give that background, not spend a huge amount of time on it, but just lay the context about why these 8 performance management myths are myths, particularly now that we're living in a world, what we call a VUCA environment, an environment that's under a lot of upheaval and change, and organisations naturally have to respond to that, which is absolutely critical. So if you've got any comment, question, as I say, go to the question box and type that in, and I'll be more than happy to respond to that. Okay, so what I've done here is, over on the left-hand side, is that I have put down my organisational agility model. Now, this organisational agility model is really an attempt to say that if we're really measuring our capacity as an organisation to be agile, we actually need to make sure that there are 7 dimensions to that. So that when you look at your organisation, and if you're a consultant, when you go into an organisation, you can use this model to start to assess the capacity of that organisation to be agile, because agility means a lot more than, just being innovative, for example. There's a lot to agility that's critically important. So look, just very quickly, let me take you through the model, and you can have a think about this in terms of your own organisations and where they fit. But if you go up to the top, innovation, okay, we'd all accept that organisations need to be innovative, although there's still enormous struggles for that to occur. And one of the reasons, or actually a lot of the reason for that, is because of these old myths that we're still operating on from a performance point of view, and I'll get to that in a minute. But yes, we need to be the first into the market with the first product, and take first, advantage of that. So yeah, absolutely. We also need to be able to process things quickly through an organisation in the interest of the customer. Now, we've all been on the receiving end of some, perhaps pardon me if you're from a government agency, but I'm sure you accept what I'm saying. We've all been on the receiving end where it seems to have taken weeks or even months, and sometimes even years, to get answers or get our need met in an agency. That's because their process speed is very slow. So obviously, in order to be agile, an organisation has to have speedy processing. They've got to be able to get people processed, if you like, as quickly as possible. So that's obviously got to be one of the dimensions of agility. Another dimension of agility has to be recovery. Now, what this means is that when mistakes are made, and I make an assumption here because I think it's true, all organisations make mistakes. All organisations mess up. Now, the question is not how do we stop messing up, because we do our best to do that, but there's always going to be mistakes made. The question then becomes, what do we do when we've messed up? How quickly can we recover from that? So the quicker an organisation can recover from a customer's mistake, the more forgiving the customer is likely to be. And I mean, if we all think about this in our own way, I mean, if we get the wrong meal served to us in a restaurant or something, if we know that our the error is being dealt with quickly, then we're often quite okay with that. So because we know that we're a priority. So recovery speed has to be part of the agility model. Continuous improvement, as distinct from innovation, is around incremental change, continually making things efficient, and of course that's a critically important part, and it's still something we're struggling with 25 years after Peter Senge came up with his learning organisation. So we've still got blockages in our system because of the management myths, or the performance myths, that I'm going to run through very shortly. Now, we need to be customer responsive. Now, by that, I'm certainly not talking about customer service. That's naturally old hat, or customer satisfaction. I'm talking about the concept that everything we say, think and do is actually having the customer in mind. So every decision that's made in a boardroom, every decision that's made on the shop floor, every design that is made in the drafting area, all of those things are actually in the interests of the customer. It's easy to say that, isn't it? It's much more difficult to do, but that has to be a criteria around agility. If we assume that agility is about responding quickly to the marketplace. We also need to be quick in terms of our capacity to problem solve because of the unique nature of what's happening in the world. We need to be able to be good problem solvers. And it's amazing to me how few people actually have that critical thinking in organisations. We don't tend to teach that very much. We tend to give people a manual and say, you need to follow that manual to the letter. And therein lies one of the myths that I'll get into in a moment. And of course, because giving them a manual, a paint-by-numbers approach, the assumption is, well, you know, we will produce quality. But of course, now the customer and the marketplace is far more fickle and far more demanding. And as a result of that, it's far more complex than it once was. Changing direction is the final of the 7 dimensions. And changing direction is about being able to, you know, change the market or change the product line or change a department or whatever it might be. The capacity to change direction quickly has to be part of organisational agility. So they're the 7, and of course I go into them in some detail and show you some practical ways of being able to do those 7 things in the book. But that gives you a bit of an idea of what I'm on about when I talk about organisational agility, and it also gives you a very practical idea of what I mean when I demonstrate the folly of these 7 performance myths that I'm going to go through right now. All right, so let's get stuck into it. The very first myth, and these aren't necessarily in any order, so I'm not suggesting that this is the most prevalent myth. I might just give a bit of background and say, where did these myths come from? Well, a lot of these myths came from the scientific management movement of the early part of the last century. So when Frederick Taylor went into the Ford Motor Company and other particular production areas and applied his time and motion studies, what he was trying to do is to find the one best way of doing the various components on the assembly line. And what he was able to do ultimately was increase profits, which of course, as we know, is the first measurement of organisational performance. So he was actually able to do that quite effectively. So the concept of scientific management is an area where a lot of our myths come from. In other words, we're still operating on these myths. I'll give you a classic example. The concept of breaking the assembly line up into small bite-sized pieces and having a process for each was beautifully implemented by the McDonald's Corporation. The McDonald's Corporation decided to do exactly that, and of course when people purchase a McDonald's outlet, they spend their money on a chopped up assembly line, a system. That's what people are buying. And of course that was successful, and that's perpetuated into other franchise systems as well. So Frederick Taylor, I would argue, is the most influential management thinker or consultant that the world has ever come across. His influence is enormously pervasive, and the first myth is job specification improves performance. And what I mean by that is, you know, a job specification entails breaking down a job into the simplest component parts and assigning them to an employee to perform that task in a consistent manner. So, you know, chopping it all up and making it very simple and easy to control and manage. It's ineffective environments where there's rapid change or unpredictability, because obviously the landscape can change quickly, which will make the systems inside the business redundant very quickly. So questioning the status quo in a specialised workplace is not as valued as following the status quo. So people are actually rewarded for following the status quo, not questioning it, even though the rhetoric is around, well, we want you to bring your brains to work, we want you to come up with ideas. Well, all our rewards are about actually following systems, not changing them. So one way of stimulating agile behaviour is using a concept called flexible deployment. So yes, of course we've got to have specialisation in workplaces, and I'm not for a minute suggesting we just toss it all out. As I said before, there's always a smidgen of truth to each of these myths. Of course we need to have manageable processes that we know work. Nobody questions that. But what we need to do is to implement a system where people are also flexibly deployed. In other words, they don't just stick to one particular silo. They can work and manoeuvre across a number of different competencies, if you like. And as you can see on the screen, it's just a very simple example of what I'm talking about, which is a skills matrix, where you can see the people over on the left-hand side. These people belong to a team, and across the top you have a number of different competencies. And the idea is that the shading demonstrates people's level of competency across those competencies. The black is showing that people are not only competent, but they also have the capacity to coach other people in that particular skill. The dark grey means that they're competent but not yet ready to coach anybody. The light grey means that I've started training in that competency but I'm not quite where I need to be. And the white means I've had no exposure whatsoever. This is an excellent organising tool to start to build a flexibly deployed workplace. The goal here, of course, is to have everybody in that team at least at the dark grey area by a specified time. By doing that, we've got a flexibly deployed team. So you might say, well, what are these things up here? What are these? That's up to you. That's your business. You've got to work that out. You've got to work out what your categories are. Not everything's open to be flexibly deployed. That's understood. But there is a lot of things in our workplace that are, and that's the point. All right, moving right along. The second myth is that quality systems and processes guarantee good outcomes. Now, it's going to sound like I'm a bit of an anti-QA person here. I'm not. Again, we've got to have quality assurance systems in place, but they mustn't rule every single thing that we do, because if they do that, we've got a problem. The concept of producing quality didn't start with scientific management, but Taylor elevated the status of QA by demonstrating its significance to organisational performance. Okay, so in broad terms, QA is perfecting the way things are done to produce quality products and services to meet the needs and expectations of the end user. So despite the emphasis on the customer, quality is mostly measured by whether an organisation meets certain standards or criteria. It gets the literal seal of approval from a governing body or an industry standards group, which is quite ironic, isn't it? So while we're doing all this to meet the customers' demands, the key thing here is to make sure that all the boxes are ticked so we get a seal of approval. So I find that quite interesting. So quality assurance is not the total answer. It's a very good part of it on focusing on the customer. It's not the total part. And developing trends that illustrate the need for products and service providers to be flexible. So we need to be customer responsive as well as QA assured. We need to have these two balancing acts going on at the same time. So an organisation needs to be flexible and manoeuvrable, or agile, as I mentioned earlier, and also have quality assurance systems in place. It's not an easy balancing act, but it's what I call an ambidextrous organisation, an organisation that can do both of those things at the same time. So it's very, very important to be able to build upon the QA systems in place. And all of us have come across businesses where there's just no manoeuvrability whatsoever. You just have to do things by the book. And, I can understand that government agencies, because of the level of accountability, have to do things by the book to a certain extent. But if that rules everything, then it's not going to produce a performance-oriented organisation. It'll produce a very efficient organisation, perhaps. Arguably, it may not. So the antidote to quality systems is customer focus. So that's the next myth, and of course I go into great detail there in the book about that. So moving right along, myth 3. What's myth 3 all about? Myth 3 is that the job description helps the employee understand their organisational role. Now, where did that myth come from? Well, again, by chopping up the assembly line into bits and pieces, we're able to give people a piece of paper, a work document, which indicates to them what they're supposed to be doing. Now, does that mean they understand their role? Well, what it means is they understand the technical component of their role. That is, they understand how to operate this machinery. They understand that, you know, when this happens, they're supposed to do that. Yes, to a certain extent. So again, there's a smidgen of truth to it, but they don't understand their organisational role. Let me illustrate. Over on the right-hand side is what I would call the life cycle of an employee. So when an employee comes into an organisation, you'll notice on the right-hand side that, well, obviously they're recruited and selected. Now, how are they recruited and selected? Based on the job specification. And where does that come from? The job description. So we ask questions in the interview that are specific to the job description. So we're ignoring the organisational role. We then induct them, and while we're inducting people, we talk to them about their we talk about their job based on their job description. So we want to familiarise them with their job. Then we train and develop them based on their job. So most of the training that we do, 80% of it perhaps, is technically focused on the job, help them improve their job. Then we remunerate them on the basis of how they're performing their job. Even the succession planning that we use in the promotion is based on the job. Hence we get lots of leaders who are promoted because they're good technically, because that's how we use we use the job description as a succession plan. And of course we measure performance on the job. So we've got this enormous reliance on the job description. But the job description is inadequate. Let me explain why. You notice over here, work performance is split into two categories. Obviously, you've got the job role, which is the key result areas and the competencies and the KPIs. That's all captured in the job description. So that's captured, no problem. But I would argue that work performance is a lot more than just simply doing what's on that piece of paper called the job description. There are non-job roles that are critically important as well. So what might they be? Well, I've identified 4, and I don't see many job descriptions with these 4 written on, but if they are, they're usually written at the back somewhere, usually nowhere near as in depth as the key performance indicators in the technical part of the job description. So, positive mental attitude and enthusiasm. I don't expect people bouncing off the walls when they come to work, but I certainly don't expect them to be negative and sabotaging the morale that we have in the workplace. I expect people to be able to operate in teams. I expect people to continually grow and develop so that they can bring those skills with them to the workplace, both for the interests of the company and for their own interests as well. I also expect people to bring their ideas to work to help develop the organisation. So there's an example of critically important non-job roles that aren't usually wrapped up in the job description, and hence we're missing half of the... I mean, just imagine an organisation that didn't embrace those 4. Just imagine an organisation where everyone was negative, everyone was an individual and not a team player, everyone had stopped learning after their trade or university degree, and everyone decided not to bring their brains to work with them. Can you imagine how effective that organisation would be, or should I say ineffective? So you can see that the job description, we place way too much emphasis on it. We should be actually using role descriptions, and of course the book goes into that in great detail as well. Okay, moving right along. What's myth number 4? Myth number 4 is that a business is best organised around functions. Okay, now, when I go as a consultant into organisations, typically a senior manager will show me the organisational chart. And most of the time the organisational chart will be like you have on your screen. What I mean by that is simply that it's siloed. It's based on functions. That we have the marketing department, we have the operations department, we have the finance department, and so forth. Now, again, that's come out of Taylor's scientific management model, where if we group like-minded individuals together, it will create a degree of efficiency and effectiveness. So the bureaucracy has been around for 100 years, and that's the model that I reckon 90-odd% of organisations still embrace when they're actually trying to organise their work. But if you look at it, there's obviously some issues with it. The issues are that because it's silo-based, that the operations and the finance department don't often talk to each other, or certainly not to the extent that they should be. And that in order for me to actually talk to anyone cross-functionally, I have to usually go through my boss, and that takes time. So you've got a whole lot of issues around discord in organisations, around time, and also a lack of cross-functional communication. And that can be a real issue. So what happened is that in the world, people thought, well, there must be a better way of doing this. So the matrix model came into play. And the matrix model essentially means that, yes, we'll keep our silos, but we also acknowledge that there are projects as well. There are also projects as well that are critically important. And because there are projects, we have two bosses. We have a project manager and we have a functional manager. Now, the problem with this approach, of course, and any of you who have been involved in this would know that it can be quite confusing in terms of who do I report to about what. And it takes a hugely competent leadership team to make a matrix model work very well. Then we evolved to the concept of a product model. The product model is, why don't we just acknowledge that what we do is essentially around producing services and goods for people. So therefore, if that's the case, why don't we structure our whole business around products and services? And so the product model came into play. And the product model in lots of places can be quite successful. So for example, engineering, there's some engineering and construction firms that base their whole organisational chart around the product model and do that very, very effectively. So that's certainly a way forward, but none of those have really been very effective. So it sort of begs the question, how can we organise work more effectively if, the functional model, we've tried that, we've tried the matrix model, we've tried the product model, what else can we try? Here's a suggestion. And I might just preface this model of mine by saying that there is no perfect way of organising work. Every time you organise work in a particular way, there will be some shortcomings somewhere. However, I've tried here, and of course I go into this in detail in the book, but I try very much here to start to look at the weaknesses of the previous three models and try and incorporate them in this model. And I call it a customer-centric model. Why so? Well, you can notice the very obvious first thing is that the customer's in the centre. And I suppose philosophically and practically, why wouldn't the customer be in the centre? Now, that doesn't mean even if you're a government department, you've still got customers or you've still got taxpayers. So why don't we put them front and centre? Isn't it funny how nearly every single organisational chart has no mention of the customer? I find that fascinating. So yeah, let's throw the customers in there. We can then actually divide that inner circle up into different categories if we choose. So you could actually do that. Then you notice the next layer. I'll just do the layers first and then I'll talk about the dotted lines. The next layer is the frontline staff. So obviously their job is to deal directly with the customer. So essentially their job is to be resourced with what they need in order to be able to do the very best they can to be responsive to the customer's needs. So behind them is an operational focus around producing good services and problem solving, and also, if it's a manufacturing environment, it might include the building of, tools or whatever. So that has to be effective. And you'll notice that the second outer layer is projects. So whilst we have these operations going on in the organisation, we also should have cross-functional projects occurring. The cross-functional projects occurring could be things like I've got on the page there. In other words, these are small groups of people right across the organisation that get together on a regular basis and discuss and come up with recommendations around issues such as workplace culture, rewards and incentives. How can we make the organisation more efficient? How can we make it more productive? Safety and well-being. Well, you normally have a cross-functional team around that already. How do we make our recruitment and selection process even more effective? And how do we actually improve on our product and service quality? Now, I would suggest that it might be a good idea to start to say that everybody in the organisation, if we consider the concept of organisational citizenship, everybody is responsible to be on one of these particular project teams. And that these teams don't meet every day, but they might meet once a month, and they come up with suggestions and recommendations of improving the organisation. And the last area there is strategic. The strategic is the management. You'll notice that that's the furthest out from the centre, because the strategic has an overview, or should have an overview. So the management really is about, how do we adhere to the big picture and make this operation work effectively. The projects are closest to the strategic because we want the strategic managers to take a personal interest in the projects. We also want them, of course, to lead the operations, and of course there are leaders in the operational area, and there are leaders even in the frontline area, so they're scattered throughout. What are the dotted lines? The dotted lines are the functions. So yes, it is probably still applicable that we have a marketing department, perhaps we have a finance and administration department, but you'll notice they're dotted lines. So what it's basically saying is that they're not the be-all and end-all. Certainly there are things that are done differently, but they're not to the stage where they are the main organising function. So you might like to have a think about that. You might like to think about whether the organisation models that you're using are actually helping or hindering. So that's another myth that if we don't organise things around functions, then we're not using the most effective way of doing things or organising things, which is not necessarily the case. Now, myth number 5 is that the organisation or a satisfied employee is actually a productive employee. A satisfied employee is a productive employee. Now, we spend our life giving people extrinsic rewards in order to keep them satisfied so they don't go off and work for the competition. This is what we call the carrot and the stick. The stick is used, of course, as a sanction, and the carrot is used as a reward. And we tend to give people these rewards to keep them satisfied. But what happens is that we don't involve the hearts and minds of people. So all of this material that's out there on engagement at the moment really is getting to the heart of the matter about how do we engage people in the work that they do. And I think the first place to look is how we reward people. Now, am I suggesting we shouldn't give people carrots? Am I suggesting we shouldn't use the stick every now and again? No, I think there's a time and a place for carrots and sticks. But if our whole motivation strategy is based on carrots and stick, we're going to have problems engaging employees. Because not only are these carrots and sticks expected, they really only just satisfy people. They do nothing more than that. Now, Daniel Pink wrote a great book several years ago called Drive, well worth getting hold of if you haven't already. And he argued that there are three core attributes or dimensions that were critically important if you're trying to win the hearts and minds of employees, particularly knowledge workers. He argued that they included autonomy. Autonomy is the capacity to give people an opportunity to be selective about how they actually attended to their work. And remember again, Frederick Taylor said, there is a one best way and you are to follow that one best way, and that's what's happening now. We've still got that system in place. And it may well be the best way, technically, it's a scientific management model, but is it actually engaging the hearts and minds of people? Probably not. So the argument I would put is it really the one best way if it doesn't do that? So giving people a little bit of freedom and autonomy to make decisions. The second dimension that Pink talks about is mastery. He argues, and I certainly believe this, that people, not everybody, but most people, actually want to do better and better. They want to master certain skills. They want to be good at things. And he argues that in order to get intrinsic motivation to occur in organisational employees, you need to give people a chance to do what Abraham Maslow called self-actualise. We need to give people opportunities to grow and develop. And the third dimension is people need purpose. Purpose means I know why I'm doing something. And as Dave Ehrlich said in his book, The Why of Work, it is the why of work. So we need to explain why we want people to do things. And managers and leaders traditionally don't spend much time on the why. And I think that's critically important. So what we're trying to do in this area here is instill intrinsic motivation and get the attention off extrinsic motivation, because we're relying too much on extrinsic motivation, the carrot and the stick, in other words. All right, there's a question here. I'll pause and I'll just respond to that. So thank you for the question, Chris. The question is, hi Tim, what about the concept of staff as customers? Your customer will never be happier than your staff. Yeah, I think that's a really nice question, Chris. I think, look, if you walked into any organisation, I think Tom Peters came up with this concept, you walk into any organisation and how you're treated, well, certainly in my case as an experienced consultant, how you're treated will tell me a lot about the leadership of that organisation. If people are happy in the work they do, they will tend to project that to the people that they deal with, of course, the customers, and vice versa. So if you're wanting people to engage with, people, the end user, the customer, the key concept there is to give people a chance to be happy at what they're doing. And I've given you three ways of doing that: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And if you can keep those three in mind, you'll be going a long way. So thanks for that question. Okay, moving right along. Myth number 6, which I think a lot of us, embrace. A loyal employee is an asset to the business. Now, isn't that true? Isn't that what we want? Don't we want loyal employees? I think not. Are loyal employees helpful? Well, to a point, perhaps. But somebody that's been in an organisation for 20 years, often gets rewarded for that. They get the flat screen colour telly after they've been there for 20 years. Now, I'm not against that, but what message is it sending to people? The message is, look, if you spend 20 years here, you're going to get rewarded. Well, I don't want someone there for 20 years unless they're doing productive things. So they might be just coasting along for 20 years and they get rewarded. So what I'm actually after is committed employees, not loyal employees. So I'm not after loyalty, I'm after commitment. Now, that is critically important because if I can get somebody who's committed, I'm going to get a much better bang for my buck, if I can put it crudely. So how do you do that? Well, if you do a lot of the things that I've suggested, that'll go a long way, but Meyer came up with an interesting model around organisational commitment, and Meyer and Allen said that basically there are three ways to keep an employee committed. One is they have a desire to stay. What's a desire? They desire because they believe in the mission of the organisation. Now, for a not-for-profit, that can often be very strong and compelling. So it might be doing something like dealing with homeless youth. People want to stay there because they believe in the cause. So if you give people and paint a picture of a cause, they'll often be there, and you can turn anything into that. So somebody working for local government is not doing that necessarily. They're working for the community. They're working for they're working for a better community, not for the local government. The cost of leaving is probably the most negative one. That is, what is the cost of me leaving and going across the road and getting another job somewhere else? The cost of leaving could be that I'll lose all my friends. I found it very interesting in this part of the world, and I know some of you aren't from Queensland, but I can tell you that when the mining boom was happening here, what happened was that a lot of people from local government went and worked for the mines because they doubled their income, basically, so their extrinsic rewards were increased. But I also spoke to a lot of people that didn't go, and I said, why didn't you go? They said, well, I really actually enjoy working here. I've got all my friends, I've got, I've got conditions that are great. I'm happy with that. So it's interesting, isn't it? So creating a cost for leaving can actually be a compelling reason to stay. And then a feeling of obligation. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. That can be quite important in the sense that if we give people, opportunities to grow and develop, they will often want to stay. So that becomes quite critically important. So myth number 7, we're almost there. Myth number 7 is a technically superior workforce is a pathway to a high-performing business. Well, again, don't get me wrong, there's a smidgen of truth to that. Obviously, a workforce that doesn't have technical competencies clearly going to struggle, but if it's the be-all and end-all of everything you do, then it'll struggle as well. So here's a little thought. Most organisations in their L&D program, learning and development program, will spend 80% of their dollar on technical prowess, technical skills. So these are skills that are related directly to the job description. Why do they do that? Because they get the biggest bang for their buck. Well, in the sense that what happens is that when you send someone off to a technical course, you can measure very quickly by observation whether they've got their, whether they're actually applying the skills. So you get a very quick return on investment. As soon as they come back in the workplace, they can do things differently. So I'm not anti-technical training, but I would argue that what you should do is have a third of your budget on technical, which in this case, as you can see on the screen, is job-centred. So 1/3 of all training is towards getting people better equipped to do their job. 1/3 on personal development, and that is about getting them to develop themselves as people, because the argument here is that, if we can develop people, indirectly we'll have a better workforce. So, of course, technical development, personal development has been a critically important plank of learning and development for the last 25 years. One that's sadly neglected is the last one, problem-centred learning. Why don't we train and teach people to be better at solving problems? We don't. We teach people to follow a manual, to follow a process, to think inside the square, not outside the square. So you don't have to send people off to courses, by the way, for problem-centred learning. You could get people around a room in a management meeting and simply say, here's a scenario that happened last week. Let's brainstorm ways of making sure it doesn't happen again. And that's problem-centered learning. And everyone pitches in. I remember doing this years ago with an airline. We got, pilots in the room, we got engineers in the room, we got flight attendants in the room, we got administrators in the room, we got a slice of the organisation. And I put a scenario to them and I said, the plane is grounded. The plane is grounded. What happens? And I wanted them to talk through their processes to me because it was very functionally based. And I remember the captain or the pilot in the workshop saying, well, there needs to be an announcement from the flight attendant. That's the first thing. And the flight attendant looked back at the pilots and said, well, you guys got the clout up the front of the plane. You need to make the announcement, and went on and on and on. So problem-centered learning. So 1/3 budget on job, 1/3 on people, and 1/3 on problem. And that's a pretty good model, I think, to shatter this myth that technical training is the be-all and end-all of everything we do in the organisation. Okay, moving right along. The eighth and final management myth, at least in my book, is the management myth around employees can't be trusted with sensitive information. Now, this is a very real myth. The reality is that some employees can't be trusted and some can. But yet what we do is we take management in and we explain everything to them and tell them that, Chatham House rules, this stays in the room. The assumption, meaning, of course, that managers can be more trustworthy than employees. Well, of course, that's not lost on employees. They know that. And, of course, that sends a very bad signal that we're not trusted. Now, I'm not suggesting that every single thing that happens in an organisation should be shared, but a hell of a lot more should be shared than what currently is, no question. And this is, over on the left-hand side, this is what I call the initiative paradox. Let me walk you through the initiative paradox, because this is very real, I'm sure, in many of your organisations. All right, so the first stage is up the top there. The leader wants initiative from employees, right? So most leaders I speak to want employees to think for themselves and to show initiative. And you know what? The employees actually want to display initiative as well. So they're both on the same page. The employee wants more freedom and the leaders want them to show more initiative. So far so good. Then what happens is the leader actually invites, this is in the second circle there, the leader then invites employee initiative. And then the rhetoric in the meetings is, we want you to show your initiative. You come up with a good idea, we'll back you. So that's the thinking. The employees aren't really sure, though, that management's serious. So they sit back very skeptically and say, I'm not sure that this is real. I'm not doing anything. I'm going to sit back and do nothing, because this is the first time in a blue moon my manager's ever said this to me. And I notice it's happened after a workshop that he went to, or she went to, with Tim Baker. I'm just wondering what that's all about. I mean, maybe it's not real. So they do nothing. So what actually happens is the leader then fills the void. They do what they wanted others to do. They take more control. And what happens is the employee sits back and goes, aha, I knew it. They weren't serious about it. And skepticism comes into play, you see. So it's a paradox. It goes round and round in a circle, and it's and the only way to break that cycle is by sharing information with people. And in the book, and I haven't got time to go into it, but there are 4 strategies that I explain in the book around how that can be done, very practical strategies. By giving people more information, you are increasing their perspective. So that's another myth that can perpetuate in organisations and affect the way things are. I have another question here, so I'll respond to that right now. I have seen this point so many times during my career, Tim. This is I'm assuming, Steve, you're referring to the initiative paradox. If not, I apologise. But it's real, and so having a meeting and just telling your employees that, I want you to show initiative and expecting them just to jump up and do that, it's not going to work. You've got to give people time. You've got to convince people that you are serious about that. Not quite so simple to do. So thanks, Steve, that was the point that you were making. And thanks for validating the point I've just made. All right, so they're the 8 values. So there are the 8 myths. Now let me summarise so that I've thrown a lot at you, and I think I just want to simply tie this all up so that you walk out of this broadcast with some clarity. Aim for a flexibly deployed workforce, and there are tools such as the training matrix to do that, as I showed you. Balance the customer focus with quality assurance. So you've got 2 important variables, the customer and the quality assurance system. Make sure that one doesn't dominate. That's easier said than done, and it takes quite an ambidextrous organisation to do that, but nevertheless it's critically important. Replace your job descriptions with role descriptions. They're not just a play on words. A role description, I've got a book on that called The End of the Job Description. Role descriptions encapsulate non-job performance, which is what I went through earlier in the broadcast. 4, organise work around projects, not functions. You'll go a lot better on that, because essentially everything we do in organisations, if you think about it, is actually part of a bigger project. So why aren't we doing that more so than we currently are? 5, build intrinsic motivation to supplement extrinsic motivation. So use autonomy, mastery and purpose as the critical ways of building intrinsic motivation. You are trying to capture people's hearts and minds in the workplace, and it can be done, but it can't be done with carrots and sticks. Cultivate commitment rather than loyalty. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. As I said, I'd rather have a person that's there for 2 years who is totally committed than someone that's been there for 20 years who's going through the motions. It's just the way it should be. There's no question about that. Number 7, broaden your learning and development to cover personal and problem-based learning. And as I said, 1/3 of the budget goes to personal, 1/3 to problem and 1/3 to job. And number 8, have open channels of communication, not closed. So share information with employees. Yes, there's always a risk that they will run off to the union, or yes, it's quite possible that something might be leaked to the press. Look, things can be leaked anyway, regardless of whether there's any communication. So, it's always a risk, but some of those leaks happen in the management boardroom as well. And so, this myth about employees can't be trusted is nonsense in lots of cases in my experience. So if you take people in and you explain to them the reasons, ask them for their confidential, cooperation, you'll normally get it. That's been my experience, all things being equal. So just to finish up, just a couple of things that you might find interesting. I have a Leadership Learning at Lunchtime series, which is basically a series of 1-hour webinars for middle managers, which is conducted at midday. So it's a lunchtime exercise, which basically means that people aren't spending lots of time out of the workplace. It's very cost effective, and I commend that to you. So if you're interested in that, please send me an email, and I'm more than happy to send you some more information about that. We've got a series coming up very soon, and people can plug into that at minimal cost. The other thing I'd say is I've got a few more free webinars coming up for the rest of the year, and if you go to my website www.winnersatwork.com.au, you will find that you can just click on any of those webinars and just register as you did for today, and you're in. So that's another opportunity for you, which I hope you might take advantage of, and I know many of you have done that. And I'd say my final comment to you is that, oh, the image is gone, but the book that I have coming out, which is called oh, there it is there. I animated it. The book that I have coming out at the end of the year, which encapsulates everything that I've gone through today with far more practical application, is not available yet. It'll be out in December. But if you send me an email, I'll put you on a list and I will give you an advance copy and I'll sign it for you at a 30% discount. So if you just simply send me an email, say I'd like to be on the list, I will make a list up and I'll give you a coupon, so when the book's available you will be able to get it at 30% before anybody else and sign. So just a final plug there that might be something that you're interested in. So thanks folks, thank you very much for the opportunity of working with you. I've enjoyed that and I'm on time here, which is good. Thank you for those that ask questions. If you've got other questions that you want to ask, you know where to find me. Send me an email and I'm more than happy to have a chat to you online about some of the questions or queries that you have. So all the very best and have a wonderful whatever's left of the rest of the day. Thank you.